Last month marked 6 years since Russia invaded Ukraine, 6 years of conflict in Ukraine, and it's not cold by any means, with ceasefires that fail to hold to this day. I'd like to start the hearing with a brief clip, if we could, from less than a year ago, because I think it's important to remember how devastating this conflict has been and how, importantly, it continues today.
Мы достаточно эффективно работали в рамках стабилизационных действий из-за разрешенным Минском. Противник за последнюю неделю многократно нарушил Минск. В частности, были обстрелы 122-м калибром, гаубицами. Очень сложно находить мотивацию, неся потери. То есть, они несут потери, и это не может не сказываться на морально-психологическом состоянии. То есть, если, допустим, ты заступаешь в 2 раза чаще, почему? Потому что замены нету. То есть твои собутыльники уже 300-е или 200-е.
I'd also like to recognize Ambassador Yelchenko of Ukraine and a delegation of Ukrainian veterans. And thank you for joining us. If you could please stand and be recognized. The subcommittee is meeting today, as I mentioned, to hear testimony on Putin's frozen conflicts and conflict in Ukraine. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous material for the record, subject to the length and limitation in the rules. I'll now make an opening statement. As we've seen from the films that we've just witnessed, the conflict in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, continues. This is Ukraine, and however, when we look around the region, Ukraine simply is the most recent instance where Russia has exploited divisions and deployed resources to destabilize the borders of its post-Soviet neighbors. Today, we're looking at the conflicts in Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. Each took a place in different decades, and Russia's intervention in each was very different as well. However, to this day, none of these countries maintains full control over its borders, and it is instead trapped in the incredibly precarious situation of striving to make critical reforms to strengthen democratic governance and develop closer ties to the West, all while being unable to fully govern and serve all its citizens. In Moldova, fighting ceased in the 90s when the conflict displaced some 130,000 people in the multi-ethnic region of Transnistria. However, despite decades now of dedicated diplomatic efforts, Russian troops remain in the region, and as recently as 2018 were reported to be carrying out military exercises there. In Georgia, more than 800 military personnel and civilians died in the conflict, and 20,000 Georgian residents were forced to leave their homes in now occupied regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Ethnic Georgians who remained faced harassment and discrimination and lack access to many basic services and economic opportunities. In Ukraine, the war still continues in the east. Nearly 1.5 million Ukrainians have been displaced, and over 13,000 lives have been lost, including over 3,000 civilians. In Crimea, which was once an economic hub of tourism for Ukraine, people there essentially live in a police state. It's important that we take the time to assess these conflicts for a few reasons. First and foremost, because of the incredible human toll they've taken on local communities. Innocent civilians have lived through these wars and this destruction because of Russia's arrogance and aggression. We must not lose sight of how these conflicts have directly harmed generations of Moldovans, Georgians, and Ukrainians. Further, it's important that we remember that these countries are pro-Western and working to strengthen their democracies and ties with Europe and the United States, both economically and in terms of our security partnerships. These are our friends and partners. If we're to succeed in overcoming the global crisis and challenges we face in climate change, terrorism, and threats from Russia and China, our best path forward is to work together in a broad coalition of partners who share our democratic values. And these countries will be strong partners once they've achieved sovereignty over their own borders. Russia clearly knows that too, and that's the reason why this is not the time for us to let our support wane from these countries or let politics get in the way of our clear security interests in this region. Because finally, we cannot be naive and act as if Russian aggression is over. The Kremlin continues to identify fissures in the West and deploy minimal resources to tear wide open and allow them to stay frozen and festering. We need an informed, realistic response to Russia's tactics. So far, we've failed to reach resolutions to any of these conflicts, and instead have allowed them to remain distractions that pull resources away from the critical work we must be doing to grow and strengthen our coalition of allies to address the shared challenges and threats ahead. We didn't plan for the conflict in Moldova, nor after that the conflict in Georgia, nor after that the conflict in Ukraine, and still none of these conflicts are resolved. It's past time we identify why our efforts so far haven't been successful, change course to not repeat the same mistakes, and learn from these conflicts so that we're prepared to address what we should assume will be inevitable future Russian aggression in the region. That's why I'm pleased we're joined by a distinguished panel of witnesses who can speak to these realities and the realities on the ground and our efforts to date in resolving them. Thank you all for being here, traveling great distances to join us, and I turn now to the ranking member, Representative Kinzinger, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To our guests testifying, thank you for being here. To our guests here, thank you for being here as well. One thing that we need to remember is Russia is kind of a paper tiger. So militarily, whenever the United States pushes back on Russia, they're quiet. Whenever Turkey pushes back, frankly, on Russia, they grow quiet. They're good at going up to a brick wall, but obviously stopping when they hit that because they have no ability to make it through. I remember during the initial Crimea situation, I was downstairs on the treadmill watching the news, and I remember seeing I think it was a Ukrainian naval commander that stood and faced down Russian forces, and he said, "The United States is with us." And I remember watching that on the treadmill and getting pretty choked up because I knew what it meant to be America and to be an American, and I was very proud. When we look at the conflicts right now in Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, it's important to note that 5 conflicts exist inside these countries, all carrying their own unique problems. They have one distinct common denominator, however, and that is Russia. These conflicts have shown Russia's willingness to use an advanced set of tools to prevent nations that used to be within the Soviet sphere of influence from moving closer to Western institutions. One of the 5 tools developed and deployed by the Kremlin was to hide behind the guise of protecting ethnic Russians across the region. While open hostilities between Russia and Georgia have been going on since the fall of the USSR, it was Putin's distribution of passports to Georgian citizens in 2002 that laid the groundwork for Russian intervention in 2008. We now see the Russian-occupied territories of South Ossetia and Abkhazia slowly moving their borders to occupy more Georgian territory. Many ethnic Georgians in these regions have fled for fear of persecution, and some have died given the lack of medical care provided inside these areas. In Ukraine, Russia used, quote, little green men in Crimea and the Donetsk regions. This tactic has allowed the Kremlin to deny any involvement in the invasion and occupation of these territories, even though we know quite better. As a result, nearly 6 million Ukrainians are now living under the control of Russia and their proxies. This may be one of the most pressing foreign policy issues that this subcommittee faces. What happens there is important to the transatlantic relationship and to our national security. Both Ukraine and Georgia have been stalwart allies of the United States since gaining their independence. The continuous provocations by the Russian Federation must be dealt with. While these cases outline the fragile situation Ukraine and Georgia find themselves in, I believe there is a silver lining. Russia intervened in both countries out of fear that freedom and democracy were approaching their doorstep. Both Ukraine and Georgia had expressed interest in increasing their cooperation with the West, especially with NATO. Putin intervened to prevent democratic values from taking hold in the region. However, this tactic drastically failed. Last year, the Ukrainians elected a political outsider who ran on an anti-corruption platform and pledged to push back on Russia's malign influence as president. Mr. Zelensky's had a difficult road ahead of him, and the United States and our European partners must be willing to assist Ukraine in countering the Kremlin. Since Georgia's independence in 1991, we've witnessed the Georgian people march towards democracy and a deeper partnership with the West. Just this weekend, our allies in Georgia proved that while Russia occupies their territory, it would not halt them from their goals of EU and NATO accession. Democracy is not easy. It needs to be cared for, and it needs to be fought for. That's what occurred in Georgia. Following months of negotiations, protests, and violence in the streets, we saw a political compromise rarely seen in established democracies like the United States, let alone a young democracy like Georgia. With the help of the American Embassy in Tbilisi and our new ambassador, Kelly Degnan, we witnessed the ruling Georgian Dream Party agree to transition towards a proportional electoral system. The ruling party willingly gave up some of their power to strengthen and protect their nation's democracy. If this does not demonstrate the Kremlin's failed strategy, I do not know what does. There's still work to be done in Georgia, like ensuring the 2020 parliamentary elections are free from interference and strengthening the business environment to allow Americans and European investment. But our Georgian allies must be commended for their work to defend their democracy. Again, I want to thank the panel for joining us today, and I want to thank the chairman for calling this. We'll have plenty to talk about, and I yield back to the chairman.
Thank you. Now for a one-minute opening, Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Chairman Keating and Ranking Member Kinzinger, for holding this important hearing on Russian aggression in Eastern Europe, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. The fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s marked a critical turning point for freedom and democracy in Europe. For the first time in more than a century, countries in Eastern Europe would have the opportunity to choose the path of democracy and self-government over the tyranny of communism and totalitarian rule. For many nations, however, these ambitions were often undermined by Russian desires to prevent these nations from moving closer to the West and away from their influence. The first decades of the 21st century have seen Russia seek to undermine, and outright halt democratic ambitions and sow discord and conflict in former Soviet countries, thus escalating tensions with the West and reviving long-held fears of an aggressively expansionistic Russia determined to maintain a stronghold on its former satellites. I look forward to today's hearings with today's witnesses and to a really informative discussion on this very important issue. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I'll now introduce our panel of witnesses. Ambassador Daniel Baer is an American politician and former diplomat currently working as a senior fellow in the Europe program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He served in the Obama administration State Department, first as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and then as United States Ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe from 2013 to 2017, directly engaging with Russian diplomatic representatives over the conflicts in Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. Mr. Simon Ostrowski is an award-winning documentary filmmaker and investigative journalist, best known for his coverage of the 2014 Crimea crisis and the war in eastern Ukraine for Vice News Service, where he investigated and made clear that Russia used unmarked soldiers to annex Crimea and highlighted the real and devastating effects on the civilian populations in eastern Ukraine and Crimea. For his coverage of the war, he was awarded the prestigious DuPont Award from Columbia University and was nominated for 2 Emmys. Ms. Alessia Vartanyan, is that correct? Is an international crisis groups analyst for the Eastern Neighborhood. Based in Tbilisi, she researches and produces reports on regional security issues in Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. Ms. Vartanya travels frequently to South Ossetia and Abkhazia, providing updates on the increasing deteriorating living conditions of those who remain in these occupied territories. She's worked for several other news outlets in the past and won the first EU Monitoring Mission Special Prize in Peace Journalism in 2013. Mr. Stephen Nix is Regional Program Director for Eurasia and the International Republican Institute. He previously worked at the U.S. Agency for International Development and spent time living in Ukraine. There he served as an outside legal counsel for the Committee on Legal Reform in the Ukrainian Parliament. Mr. Nix's polling work at IRI has provided policymakers with a window into the attitudes of Ukrainians and ethnic Russians living throughout the territories of Ukraine, as well as Georgia and Moldova. We appreciate all of you being here today. Look forward to your testimony. Please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the permanent record. I'll now go to Ambassador Baer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, and members of the committee. Thank you for holding this hearing and for inviting me to testify alongside such distinguished fellow panelists. When I was serving overseas, Simon's reporting was a crucial source of information about what was happening on the front lines. I remember when he was captured by armed militants, beaten, and held in a cellar for several days, a reminder of the risks that journalists like Simon take so that the rest of us can know what's happening. I'm grateful to be here with Ms. Vartanian and Mr. Nix, too. Crisis Group and IRI do great work around the world, and they attract great people. In recent years, we've devoted more attention to understanding how the U.S. should manage and respond to China's increasing influence and assertiveness. This is prudent. However, our focus on China shouldn't be a get-out-of-jail-free card for Vladimir Putin. Nor can we afford to allow our own domestic political convulsions to pervert U.S. foreign policy. Members of this committee took different votes on impeachment. They should not take different positions on national security threats going forward. The United States has an enduring interest in a Europe that is, in President George H.W. Bush's words, whole, free, and at peace. Putin's efforts to undermine democratic progress in Europe and to coerce European countries, particularly those that are former Soviet republics, is inimical to this strategic interest. We stand to benefit from the prevalence of rule of law, peace, and prosperity in Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, and of course their citizens do too. Putin uses his backyard as a testing ground for tactics that he can deploy elsewhere, including against the United States and our allies. The invasion of Crimea by little green men, Russian forces that, contrary to the laws of war, did not wear identifying insignia. In Donetsk and Luhansk, Russian military experimented with techniques that are more often associated with non-state actors in order to carry out their military objectives. Putin has weaponized energy security, coercing governments by turning off or threatening to turn off natural gas. Cyber attacks are another weapon in Putin's arsenal of aggression. Many Americans were aghast that Russia intervened so dramatically in our 2016 election. None of our friends in Georgia, Ukraine, or Moldova were surprised. They've been dealing with Russian active measures and opportunistic politicians who take advantage of them for years. Under Putin, Clausewitz's famous aphorism that war is the continuation of politics by other means has been inverted. For Putin, intervention in politics is the continuation of war by other means. My fellow panelists will speak to the humanitarian costs of the conflicts, and these costs should not be seen as distinct from strategic ones. Humanitarian disasters have a destabilizing effect and represent lost economic opportunity in addition to their human costs. Looking forward, the U.S. should continue to support the sovereignty and integrity of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova within their internationally recognized borders. In the case of Ukraine and Georgia, this includes continued security assistance and cooperation, which should be coupled with political support and public backing. In addition, we should continue to invest in European security more broadly, including the European Deterrence Initiative. Furthermore, we should work with NATO and our partners in the region, including Ukraine and Georgia, to coordinate strategy in the Black Sea, which Putin uses as a launch pad to wreak havoc in the Middle East. The U.S. should remain a resolute partner to Ukraine in its quest to build a more robust system of rule of law and to pursue the reforms that the Ukrainian people recognize as imperative to deliver a better future for their children. Ukraine's civil society and independent journalists hold the government to account, and we should take heed of their warnings when things are off track. In Georgia, just last weekend, the major parties agreed on a framework that, if implemented, lays the groundwork for constructive democratic parliamentary elections later this year. We must support it, and Mr. Kinzinger, I saw your statement of support in addition to Ambassador Degnan's this week. The Trump administration rightfully sanctioned the corrupt former chair of the Democratic Party of Moldova, Vlad Plahotniuc. There have been recent reports, however, that despite travel sanctions, Plahotniuc has been in the United States. This makes our commitment to enforcing consequences for corrupt actors look flimsy and raises questions about why he's being allowed to flout our sanctions. He and any family members that are under sanctions should be removed immediately. Reportedly, the Trump administration is planning to make a decision this week about the future of U.S. participation in the Open Skies Treaty. Open Skies has been a tool for showing support for Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. It's true, the Russians have been uncooperative in their participation in Open Skies and have often acted in bad faith, but we should hold them accountable. Pulling out of the OST would hand Putin a victory. In closing, I want to again thank Mr. Keating, Mr. Kinzinger, and members of the committee. I hope the committee will continue to engage on this topic and others, and will call government witnesses to explain and defend the administration's approach to these difficult issues. I'm happy to endeavor to answer any questions, and I appreciate your submitting my longer statement for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Ostrowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the committee, and Ambassador. Thank you for your kind words. I was not expecting that. 6 years ago today, when I was a reporter for Vice News, I was running around the streets of Simferopol in Ukraine's Crimea region, filming a pro-Ukraine protest, which was one of the last public displays in support of Ukrainian statehood that would be permitted in Crimea before Moscow took total control of the region and formally annexed it just a few days later. Today, in accordance with the Russian Constitution, public manifestations and protests are permitted, but what happens in practice and what's on paper are two very different things. And I know this because I've covered Russia and the former Soviet Union for the better part of the last 2 decades. I actually started my reporting career covering the Second Chechen War, which ended that Russian region's aspirations for independence. The Chechen independence movement is considered illegitimate in Russia. But I found Moscow's attitude towards ethnic Russians living under Ukrainian rule to be very different. Independence-minded Chechens are illegal separatists. Independence-minded ethnic Russians have historic rights to self-determination. Since Russia took effective control of Crimea, those who disagree with what's happened have had to flee or have been jailed. The few that dare occasionally to protest openly are quickly bundled away in police vans and handed severe sentences. In some cases, they've disappeared entirely. So how did it come to this? Well, the day after Crimea held its unrecognized referendum on independence, which was made possible by Russian troops who'd taken control of the region, I was traveling around the peninsula asking everybody I met what country they thought we were in. It was a confusing time, so answers varied. At one point, I actually shouted, "What's this country called?" to a group of teenagers who were drinking. And they replied in unison, "Russia." Others told me it was still Ukraine. In one case, a guy told me we were back in the Soviet Union. One woman I filmed at a rally responded by saying something along the lines of, "The West hasn't tasted the Russian jackboot in a while, and it's about time they woke up and smelled the coffee." And I thought it was a pretty colorful way for someone to express themselves, but after my story broadcast, I started getting strange messages from viewers. They'd seen the very same woman appear under different names at different anti-Ukraine protests in different locations around the country. They even sent screenshots from other TV reports she'd already been featured in. Same woman, different names. I started to realize that the grassroots support for splitting from Ukraine might not be so grassroots after all. The protests that were gathering in front of administration buildings and Ukrainian military bases were actually part of a massive propaganda effort that would become the hallmark of Russia's campaign to destabilize and dismember its southern neighbor. I didn't know at the time, but we'd see echoes of this strategy in the US 2016 presidential vote, where people ginned up by Russian puppet accounts on social media were told to come out into the streets and face each other in protests. The social media aspect of this strategy might be new, but the messages being put out aren't. We saw the same thing happen during the Rwanda genocide. The Hutus used radio broadcasts to dehumanize Tutsis as cockroaches, resulting in a slaughter. And in Bosnia, media aligned with Belgrade told Bosnian Serbs gangs of Muslims were on their way to rape and murder their wives and daughters. This one started a regional ethnic war and gave us the term ethnic cleansing. When I was in Crimea, the story being pushed on Russian speakers was that a fascist junta had taken power in Kiev and gangs of violent skinheads were on their way to ban the Russian language through force. Nothing could have been further from the truth. But Russian broadcasts that were blaring at full tilt out of every television in Russian-speaking homes of Ukraine sparked a war that's lasted 6 years and claimed close to 14,000 lives. The last time I was in eastern Ukraine was in December, filming a report for PBS NewsHour Weekend. After nearly 6 years of war, attitudes had really shifted. No longer did I hear from residents a full-throated defense of Russia's military presence in the region, and unlike Crimea, Russia-occupied eastern Ukraine has never been formally annexed by Moscow. Its Russian-speaking residents have been left in limbo, living under puppet regimes with no international status and no future. Many have realized that Moscow's real plan for them is not integration into Russia, but reintegration into Ukraine. Moscow is seeking a special status for the Donbass that would give it veto powers over decisions being made in the Ukrainian capital, like NATO membership or joining the European Union. Its residents are simply pawns in that plan and are beginning to think that maybe things weren't so bad before the war started after all. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Vartanian.
Good afternoon, Chairman Keating, Ranking Member Kinzinger, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Today, at this important hearing, I will speak about situation in Georgia. I have visited Georgia's two breakaway regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia many times in recent years, and every time I go, I see how life there is growing even more difficult and challenging. Weak local administrations are unable to provide basic services, and Russia has built up a new militarized divide hampering movement to and from Georgian-controlled territory. Allowed to fester, local problems can only raise the risk of protracted instability and further violence, with repercussions for the South Caucasus region and its people, as well as for already complicated U.S. relations with Russia. In my testimony, I will speak about three problem areas in particular: the internal situation in the breakaway regions and Russia's role, ethnic Georgians living in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and the situation at the line of separation. And I will begin with the internal situation. Just some examples of what the life on the ground looks like for a local resident. Last year, an old mother of my good friend in Abkhazia had to struggle with broken ribs for weeks, only because local doctors could not read the X-ray films. They did not make it on purpose. Most local doctors haven't received professional trainings for decades and often lack the equipment necessary for even the most basic health checks. Every time there is a heavy rain in Abkhazia, its main town, Sukhumi, is flooded, and rubber boats often become the only means of transport because cars can't get down the waterlogged streets. Local policemen pay out of pocket for uniforms and to fuel their cars, motivating them to seek bribes to cover these costs. Such problems dishearten local people. Nevertheless, the local elites remain broadly loyal to Russia, which is the only regional power that recognizes independence and supports the regions politically, financially, and militarily. Still, some representatives of the de facto leaderships, at least privately, expressed disappointment at Russia's reluctance to support the further development of the regions as viable states. Last week, I was in Moscow to discuss situation in the Georgian breakaway regions, and similar to all these years of the past decade, since Russia recognized Georgia's regions, many in Moscow appeared reluctant to increase Russia's investment. The second issue I want to address is ethnic Georgians living in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. There are around 50,000 of them, and they are 25% of population in Abkhazia and almost 10% of people living in South Ossetia. In addition to everyday hurdles, the local ethnic Georgians face discrimination from the local de facto authorities. Schools do not teach in their native Georgian language. They lack the right to run or vote in local elections, and they are kept out of many jobs. Few ethnic Georgians in these breakaways have local passports, and they are treated as foreigners. The lives of most of them are split between breakaway regions and Georgian-controlled territory, as they must cross into Georgia proper to earn a living, have access to medical care, and receive pensions. Crossings has never been easy, but in the last couple of years, it has become a bigger problem. And the de facto authorities close the crossings more often and for long periods of time with no warning and for reasons that often have nothing to do with security concerns. In fact, de facto authorities of South Ossetia have closed most crossing points since last September, and many ethnic Georgians living in the region were left with no income to buy food or firewood, and went hungry and cold with winter. Some Georgians from these regions told me that if problems with crossings continue, they will eventually have to immigrate. Finally, a topic some members of the subcommittee are well aware of, which is the process called borderization. For almost 9 years, the de facto authorities and Russian border guards have dug trenches, erected fences, and installed video cameras to define the line that separates Abkhazia and South Ossetia from Georgia-controlled territory. Some of these barbed wire fences run through the center of many Georgian villages, and I know that some of you saw this firsthand when visiting the region. That greatly affects the people in the area and provokes many new incidents that may have a potential to turn violent if they stay unaddressed. For all these years, the current Georgian government has responded with what it calls strategic patience. In light of its decision to normalize relations with Russia, Tbilisi made attempts to mitigate sources of friction that could undermine the normalization process. Consequently, the Georgian government has not attempted to stop efforts at borderization. In fact, it has even disrupted protests by its own citizens against Russia's actions. Nevertheless, there are signs that Georgia's strategic patience is wearing thin, and last August, the Georgian government established a police outpost in an area where Russian and de facto South Ossetian authorities had planned to build new barbed wire fences, which led to a serious escalation in tensions between both sides. And since then, months of talks helped to calm the situation. But if no steps are taken to resolve more fundamental grievances between the two sides, the parties could quickly find themselves at loggerheads again with the potential for violent clashes. My longer written statement offers some thoughts about how the United States can help to address each of these three areas and encourage greater stability in this troubled part of the world, and I will be happy to discuss these ideas in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nix.
Chairman Keating, Ranking Member Kinzinger, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. The conflicts imposed by Vladimir Putin on Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova have created military, political, and policy challenges in all three countries. In addition to providing factual analysis to you today, we hope to provide the subcommittee with recommendations on how the U.S. can engage in all three situations. Starting with Ukraine, President Zelensky has dramatically enhanced his government's efforts to resolve the crisis in the occupied territories of Donbass and Crimea. The Ukrainian government has increased its level of engagement with Ukrainian citizens still residing in these territories, improved the quality of critical public services to address needs created by the conflict, and the government has reinvigorated diplomatic efforts to increase international pressure on the Kremlin to allow for the reintegration of these territories. It is crucial that the United States does all it can to support the Zelensky government in achieving these aims. IRI polling is very clear in stating that 82% of Ukrainian citizens want the territories in Donbass to be reintegrated into Ukraine. So it's very clear how the Ukrainian people feel. In sum, Ukrainians remain resolute in their desire to restore their country's territorial integrity. Until the Kremlin removes its troops, seals the border with Russia, peace is impossible. While the conflict continues, the United States can take concrete steps to support the Ukrainian government's goal to reintegrate residents of the occupied territories into Ukrainian society. Our recommendations are as follows. First, we believe economic sanctions are having the desired effect. The United States should not only continue to impose strategic and targeted sanctions on the Russian Federation, but should expand them until Ukraine's territorial integrity is restored. The U.S. should also encourage our European allies to continue and expand sanctions. Secondly, with a monthly average of approximately 1 million checkpoint crossings in the Donbass region alone, there is a high level of civilian crossings and traffic across the territories. Why is this important? Ukrainian citizens from Donbass and Crimea cross these checkpoints in order to collect their pensions, to obtain passports, and other important legal documents that retain a legal and social relationship with the Ukrainian government in Kiev. Third, the United States should increase its efforts to support the Ukrainian government's goal of filling the information vacuum in Donbass and Crimea. Greater access to information about government-controlled Ukraine will allow residents in the occupied territories to feel more included in Ukrainian society and political processes. Now, quickly to Georgia. In Abkhazia and Ossetia, the frozen conflicts continue to impact Georgian domestic politics in profound ways, particularly regarding security and economic policy. Most notably, the very existence of Russian-backed separatist authorities have been cited as the primary barrier to Georgian accession to NATO. Public opinion in Georgia is also very clear. 85% of Georgian citizens would like to see their country have EU membership. 80% seek NATO membership. Very, very clear that Georgian citizens want their country to be integrated into the West. In terms of recommendations, we suggest the following. Again, the U.S. should expand sanctions on the Russian Federation. The U.S. should further encourage and support Georgia in playing a larger role in NATO engagement and enlargement, and provide it with a clear accession roadmap with defined benchmarks and targets. Finally, the U.S. should continue to support the Geneva International discussions, which are really the only existing format for addressing security, human rights, and humanitarian challenges stemming from these unresolved conflicts. Then finally, and very briefly on Moldova, the Transnistria conflict differs from the other two in that the conflict is generally peaceful. There's frequent people-to-people contact, and both territories have been steadily increasing their economic integration. Two quick recommendations on Moldova. The U.S. should support Moldova and Ukraine in their continued development of reform efforts, particularly regarding anti-corruption. And the U.S. should also leverage its participation in the 5+2 negotiations to build on the successes of the confidence-building measures that have been taken place to date. And I'll close, if I could, with a quote from our late, great Chairman, Senator John McCain, who spoke to a group of us about the territories that are part of our discussion today. Senator McCain said, as quote, "Putin wants Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova within the Kremlin sphere of interest. He believes that keeping the conflicts in the disputed territories alive will help him achieve that goal, a goal we cannot allow him to achieve." Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank the witnesses. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Just to quickly, if someone has a thought on this, Ms. Vartanian mentioned this briefly with the Russian people. It's always important to distinguish the Russian people from the policies of Putin himself when that's possible. Could any of you really get a sense of the Russian people's view of this, or is the propaganda that's there so widespread that they really don't have a view of this? Anyone? Mr. Nix?
As you know, Chairman Keating, we have a fairly robust program in Russia. We can't really talk about it. As you know, IRI has been designated by the Ministry of Justice of the Russian Federation as an undesirable organization. As such, any communication with us, any work with us can be criminally prosecuted. All I can say is that in our interaction with the opposition leaders in Russia, we hear stories of tremendous economic collapse, economic problems, disaffection with the leadership. You saw the results of the local elections last fall in both Moscow and St. Petersburg, where the ruling party of President Putin didn't allow its candidates to run under their own party banner. That tells you something about the slipping support that the regime enjoys right now. Again, that's anecdotal, but that's what we're hearing from the opposition.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Ostrovsky, you had background, and you were mentioning, in effect, the orchestrated manner, how their information's being manipulated. Mr. Nix mentioned about the information barrier that's there. What can we do tactically? Are we doing enough in the U.S.? Can we do more in terms of exposing this and countering these kind of activities?
I don't know if I can, as a journalist, really give recommendations to the U.S. government of how they should deal with disinformation and propaganda coming out of Russia and the former Soviet space, but I think there needs to be a wider recognition of its effect and the fact that it persists to this day and that it is a serious problem. But we also need to talk about its limitations. You know, to talk about the question that you asked earlier, I think attitudes really have shifted, and I've seen interviews with Russian sociologists that say that a lot of Russians feel buyer's remorse over the annexation of Crimea, and the effect on Mr. Putin's popularity ratings, which were bumped up a good year or two, those effects have now washed away, and he's seeing some of the lowest approval ratings that he's seen in his entire two-decade-long career as president. So while there is a lot of disinformation floating around, I think its purpose in a lot of cases when it targets us is to confuse the situation rather than push any kind of ideology by sending out various confusing, often contradictory narratives. And in Russia itself, you know, the agenda is usually to improve the Kremlin's and Mr. Putin's own ratings.
Yes. Ms. Vartanian?
Well, I will respond to your initial question about Russian people and their attitudes. I think Georgia provides quite a good example in that because more than 10 years have passed since the war. And during these years, I have seen such a great evolution in the way people think and what even my friends in Russia say about what happened in Georgia. And it started with blaming Georgia for what happened in South Ossetia. And now, actually, I see more of my friends coming and visiting me in Georgia. And I think one of the reasons for that is actually the policy that the Georgian government has kept. Georgia invited Russians to come, and even now during some of the seasons you can see more Russians actually walking along the central streets and speaking freely Russian than, let's say, 10 years ago. And I think with this kind of approach and this kind of engagement with the people, it helps to really change the moods. And because of that, actually, in my testimony, I have been calling on more engagement with those who live in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, because more can be done through more context and through more engagement so that they can see an alternative.
Great. Ambassador Baer?
Yeah, let me just add one thing to your first question, which is I agree that these things have a shelf life and they tend to go rotten like fruits in terms of the Russian people's general attitude toward them. But the other thing that I recall is that, you know, I used to joust every week with the Russian ambassador about Ukraine, and I never saw him get so angry or red-faced as when I talked about the Russian soldiers who were dying in eastern Ukraine and that the Russian government would not admit that they were Russian soldiers, and that these military men, mostly men, were going home in secret, and their families weren't being allowed to mourn them and their military deaths. And that used to drive the Russian ambassador crazy. And I think part of what we should be doing more is reminding people within Russia about the costs that these conflicts have, not just for the people in Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, but also the costs that they bear for Russians, because they do keep Russia as a pariah in the international community, and because they impose direct costs on Russians.
Interesting. I now yield to Ranking Member Mr. Kissinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, to all of you, thank you for your testimony. Mr. Baer, or Ambassador Baer, to add to what you said, you know, it's an honor to serve your country, even if it's a country we disagree with, and to deny those Russian soldiers the honor of serving their country, even if you very much disagree. If I was asked to not admit I was an American in my service to my country, I'd be pretty ticked off, quite honestly. You also mentioned talking about Russian disinformation. You know, I have a Russian-created story about me out there. If you didn't know, I created ISIS with John McCain, actually. And And there are people on the internet that believe that. And it's a real problem. You know, the reality is there's always going to be people that want to accept a conclusion that comports to their worldview. The Russians exploit that. And I think it's wrong for any administration ever, under any party, to deny the seriousness of that undermining any kind of democracy. This is part of the Russian shadow war, the shadow war of misinformation, the shadow war of little green men, because they can say they're not theirs, below the threshold kind of actions, whether it's cyber, whether it's space, whether it's putting people in there under a mercenary, the Wagner group, that supposedly are acting independently, but are not. It's a point to note. Hundreds of members of the Wagner group were killed by U.S. military a few years ago, and Russia was very quiet after that. Russia, as I said in my opening statement, they go up to a brick wall, and when they hit a brick wall, they back out. Putin's a smart man. He knows this. But he also knows he can push as far as he possibly can. And you look at the situation in the conflict recently with Turkey and how quickly, of course, Russia backed down. The point is, Russia's a paper tiger. They're a power in the region. They're somebody that has to be dealt with, but they exist. And I think it was actually John McCain, my good friend, that said they're basically a gas station. And so you go after their energy. Energy's low. That's hurting Russia. They're going to get desperate. But that's how you do these battles. And you're very clear about what their actions are. So they're very weak. I got to also mention real quickly in Georgia, the violations on the line that are happening are significant, including Russian police or local police in the occupied areas that basically are allowed and given automatic weapons when the agreement says that you can, as a police officer, only have a sidearm. The moving of the border. They understand that a Georgian response is exactly what Russia is trying to provoke. And so it puts Georgia in a tough position of how do we defend our territory but also not provoke a larger Russian response. And that's where American involvement and visits, I've been twice to that part of the area and seen the border, sends a message to Russia and the people behind the line that the U.S. is paying attention, that they are not forgotten, and that there will be consequences to a broader conflict. Let me ask first off, Mr. Baer and Mr. Nix, when we talk about NATO, Ukraine and Georgia and NATO, there's been some resistance all over in the United States, but generally I think the American people are very much in support of this, but there's resistance in Europe. When you have troops in Georgia, Russian troops in Georgia, and they say that's the reason we can't bring them to NATO, all that does is send Russia a lesson that all you have to do is put a few troops in a country and they'll never join NATO. Can you briefly talk about that, and then you, Mr. Nix?
Sure. I mean, I think you, Mr. Kinzinger, you quite aptly put the problem in front of us, which is that when we allow Russia to deny these countries to the opportunity to make their own decisions about their security arrangements simply by occupying part of these countries, we create an incentive for Russia to do that elsewhere where it wants to. And obviously, we have our policy has been since 2008 that NATO is open to membership to Ukraine and Georgia, and that we envision that eventuality. I think, because the conflicts remain unresolved, that is a stumbling block as we talk with Europeans and other NATO allies. I think one other point to make that bears making is to remind everybody that our assistance to Georgia, in particular in this case, is not a one-way street. Georgians have sent over 10,000 soldiers over a decade to serve with ISAF in Afghanistan. And so Georgia and Ukraine, and we've done joint trainings with Ukrainians as well, we do have a security relationship with them, and it is potentially even more two-way street over the long run.
That's right. We need Georgia. If you look at their location in the region, it's either stuff goes through Russia or Iran or Georgia. Georgia, pound for pound, has actually provided more force to Afghanistan than any country except the United States. Mr. Nix.
That's a salient point, that Russian presence has been the biggest barrier to NATO membership for Georgia. Again, the numbers are overwhelming in support. This is what the Georgian people want. You've correctly pointed out that our European friends are more reluctant. There are a couple of ideas percolating, one of which I know you're very well of, and that is to perhaps exempt the occupied territories from the provisions of Article 5. That's been discussed. We've tested it in polling data. There's public support for that, but it's still very tricky in domestic politics in Georgia. That could be seen in some circles as being some sort of concession, and so I don't think you'll see that come up prior to the Georgian parliamentary elections in October. But in the long term, I think it does have some appeal, and it's worth further discussion with our European allies.
Thank you. Time flies when you're asking questions, but not when you're watching other people ask questions. So thank you all. I yield back.
Great. Vice Chair Spanberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses here today. I appreciate your participation in this hearing and the thoughts that you provided. Ambassador Baer, you spoke about your, I don't remember, did you call it jousting with the Russians during your time at the OSCE? And I was wondering if you could perhaps just expand on that a bit more. And could you expand on, I'd love your perspective on how Russia does use its role at the OSCE and other international organizations to disrupt peace and reconciliation in Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. And from your perception, what can the United States do to account for the strategy that we see them employing so that we can better enable international institutions to support peace efforts? And the question's directed at Ambassador Baer, but I welcome anyone else who wants to add something as well.
So I think that's a really interesting question that merits a long discussion, which, I mean, the Russians are actually incredibly talented multilateralists. They participate in the UN, OSCE, other multilateral fora, and they often have the most skilled lawyers. They have people who have institutional knowledge and remember and can quote, when you say, I think we should do X, they say, oh, but in 1993, you proposed this and blah, blah, blah. And so, I think they are serious about their engagement in these fora. What they're not serious about is building a system of law and principles and institutions that can undergird a peaceful international politics. They use these fora as ways to advance their own national interest and only their own national interest as, and I should say, as President Putin defines it, which is really, President Putin's personal interest. It is only a slight exaggeration to say that Russia has no foreign policy as such. It only has domestic policy that manifests itself in their international political engagements. And so I think what is important for us to recognize is that they are often trying to trap us into withdrawing from international fora. They are trying to be just difficult enough to get us to pull the plug. And one of the things that we should be wary of, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't hold them accountable, but we should be wary of taking the bait and discarding things that are useful to us and that are consistent with our general principled approach to building out an international system that is girded in institutions and universal principles so that we can, over the long run, bring others like Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, knit them more firmly into the international community and hold Russia accountable.
Would anyone else want to comment on that? Perfect. Well, so then if I can go back to the OSCE just a bit more, and the work of the OSCE's Conflict Prevention Center, as well as the OSCE's Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. I'd love for you to elaborate a bit on that work, and if you have any specific recommendations that you would make that the United States, from a policy standpoint, could be doing to best support these initiatives, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So the CPC at the OSCE works across the OSCE area, and they play an important function, particularly in supporting the missions that are deployed and early on in crises, in facilitating diplomacy, et cetera. As for the SMM, it's pretty remarkable to me that it's been 6 years since we negotiated the agreement for the SMM, and I got to tell you, it was thanks to Toria Newland. My team and I were negotiating over the course of several days. The OSCE, as you probably know, decides everything based on consensus, which means that you have to get the Russians on board. And, indeed, the Russians were at that time claiming that there were these gross violations of the human rights of Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. And so part of the argument for deploying the SMM was to be an observer mission to document those things as well as any other issues of concern related to OSCE principles. And we were unsuccessful in getting them to allow an OSCE office in Crimea. That was an SMM office in Crimea, and that was part of the last piece of negotiating. And I wanted to hold out for that, and Ambassador Newland told me, "Bear, make the deal," and I did. And pretty astonished at how successful the OSCE has been over 6 years, and I know there are always complaints with a mission of over 1,000 people that is spread out across some difficult territory, but I think they've done remarkable work in documenting on a daily basis what's happening on the ground, and for policymakers, that's been incredibly important, and for the Ukrainian government that has to make a case not only to its own people, but also to the world about what continues to happen at the line of contact, what are overwhelmingly, and have been for years, overwhelmingly Russian and Russia-backed separatist violations of agreements that have been made. If there weren't an objective body to document those things, the political situation would be worse, and the situation on the ground, I think, would be more violent than it is today. And so I think the United States should continue to support the extension of the SMM, and we should continue to try to seek to support wherever we can their technical capacities and make sure that we are paying our share of the budget.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Representative Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Russian-backed, protracted conflicts in countries like Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia are incompatible with our strategic interest in a prosperous and peaceful Europe. The United States has punished Russian aggression against these sovereign countries by imposing robust sanctions, as Mr. Nix pointed out, on Russia, publicly condemning Russia's malign actions and stiffening Ukrainian and Georgian defense efforts through arms sales. We must continue to defend Europe against Russia's attempts to undermine rule of law, democracy, and sovereignty. Russia's behavior has been increasingly aggressive in the Sea of Azov and in the Kerch Strait, where it has bolstered its naval presence and begun kind of interfering with Ukrainian shipping and naval transit. Ambassador Baer, how should the United States support Ukraine against Russian efforts to diminish freedom of navigation?
Thank you, Representative Wagner. I think, I only had a moment to highlight in my opening comments, but I think one of the things that we shouldn't lose track of in this hearing is the importance of the Black Sea region strategically. And you mentioned the recent Russian efforts to limit navigation in the Kerch Strait. There was an unprovoked attack on Ukrainian naval vessels in December of 14 months ago. That was one of the instances, by the way, I mentioned the Open Skies Treaty in my opening testimony. That was one of the instances in which we used an extraordinary open skies flight in order to bring Ukrainians as well as other partners and allies on board to overfly and to see what was going on the earth below, land and sea. And so I think one of the things that's really important is for us to make sure that we are including Georgia and Ukraine, and Moldova doesn't have Black Sea frontage, but Romania is a partner in the Black Sea, as well as Turkey, in developing a concerted strategy to have security in the Black Sea region. As I said, Putin uses that not only as a way of menacing the Ukrainian Navy or the Georgians, but he uses it as a launching pad in order to wreak havoc in the Middle East, and I think we should be concerned about it for that reason as well. And going back to Mr. Kinzinger's point, this is one of the reasons why we have a strategic interest in having a long-term partnership with these countries, not just protecting them from conflicts, but also
in the interest of time, I appreciate that. Russia aggressively uses its energy dominance as a coercive foreign policy tool. However, I understand that some hope the southern gas corridor, which will connect Caspian Sea natural gas reserves with European markets, will diminish Russia's leverage in Europe. One of the southern gas corridor's 3 new pipelines is set to run through Georgia, where Russia has fomented protracted conflicts in key regions. I didn't get your proper Vartanyan. Am I close? Are you concerned that Russia will seek to destabilize the situation in Georgia to undermine the Southern Gas Corridor project?
Russia is already very well present in Georgia. Russia bears responsibility for the origins of the conflict of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. I mean, Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, and Russian military bases are located in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. These are the territories that are very close. They are very central, especially South Ossetia, inside Georgia. So because of that, it's so important actually to pay attention to the developments on the ground. And United States plays a very important role. On the one hand, it supports Georgia's policy on non-recognition, but on the other, United States is also part of the negotiation efforts that have been taking place so far. And I think that the United States can continue and reinforce its participation in that, and that can potentially, hopefully, that can help to sustain stability on the ground and also prevent new incidents and violence.
Thank you. During the Cold War, the United States used Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and Voice of America to spread the truth of freedom and democracy to the world behind the Iron Curtain. Mr. Nix, what role does Russian propaganda and disinformation play in maintaining frozen conflicts in post-Soviet countries, and how should the United States use organizations like Voice of America and Radio Free Europe to respond? In 1 second.
Thank you for that, Mrs. Wagner. Well, certainly Russian disinformation plays a huge role in Ukraine and also in Georgia. In the Ukraine case, I would say this: it's definitely affecting public opinion in the occupied territories. People there watch nothing but Russian television. The Zelensky government, as I said in my opening statement, has made a concerted policy change on how to deal with Donbass and Crimea, and that is to engage with the people who live there. They want to create connections and relationships. They want to make it easier for people to cross the border. The information space is very important. The Zelensky government has launched a Russian language television broadcast into Donbass in a way to educate people on the reforms that he is undertaking under his presidency and to connect up with the citizens. They need help. They need assistance from us. So in addition to the American-based VOA broadcast, which should be enhanced, we should be supporting the Zelensky government in all of these efforts.
That is a very good recommendation. I thank you for that. Yes. I'm out of time. I appreciate the indulgence of the chair, and I yield back.
Representative Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Mr. Nix, my question for you regarding Ukraine has to deal with the perception, your perception of the current attitudes of the Ukrainian people with respect to the United States, with respect to NATO, with respect to the EU. I served as an FBI agent in Ukraine post-Crimea, pre-Donbass. And I always took note of this in my travels throughout the country. Where do you see their attitudes right now towards the United States, towards NATO, and towards the EU?
Thank you for being here, Mr. Kirkpatrick. We appreciate the role that you've played in Ukraine and your strong advocacy of Ukraine's sovereignty. With regard to public opinion, it's very, very clear. Every poll that IRI conducts in Ukraine, the numbers in support of EU membership and NATO membership trend upward. The vast majority of Ukrainians want to see their country in the European Union, and a majority want to see their country in NATO. Now, obviously, those numbers differ when you do the breakdowns between Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine. But still, even in Eastern Ukraine, a majority of citizens want to see their country in Western institutions. And in fact, the way the question's asked, should Ukraine be part of the EU or Putin's customs union? And the results are very clear. Ukrainians want their country as part of the West.
And in that data, is there a disparity between the age groups?
Oh, obviously, young people are more predicated towards the West. Pensioners are more inclined to the degree that people do support the customs union. That's relegated to older people.
And with regard to the policy change you referenced regarding President Zelensky doing more outreach to both Crimea and eastern Ukraine, do you believe that that change is in an attempt to reunify the country or something else?
No, I think it's a clear attempt to reunify the country. And again, it's a stark departure, with all due respect, from the previous presidential administration. But his goal is to reach out and connect up with these people. That's why I said in my opening statement, 1 million people cross the checkpoints. and there's very few checkpoints. In fact, in Luhansk, many people prefer to cross between the border between Russia and Ukraine proper, not the point of contact, because it's easier. So a lot can be done by the United States to assist the government, more border crossing, ease of travel. And I can tell you, I haven't been to the border crossing at Kalinchak in Kherson Oblast, right across from Crimea. If you look across 200 yards to the Russian side, there's a gleaming bus terminal, there's a taxi place, there's restaurants, there's cafes. You're standing on the Ukrainian side, there's the border guards, us, a small kiosk to pass out some information, and a beer tent with dirt floor and some sleeping dogs. That's the difference between what people see when they leave Crimea and when they enter Ukraine proper. And it was a calculated decision by the Poroshenko administration, and I understand it. They did not want to accept the status quo, so they did not want to invest in any structure on the Ukrainian side. But this is a long-term engagement. Peace will take some time. The government very badly wants to make it easier for people to cross from the occupied territories, both in Donbass and Crimea, and that's an important initiative that the U.S. can engage in.
So what is the current status of border crossing right now? Because I've never been to Crimea. I hear it was always considered a huge vacation destination, beautiful area for the Ukrainians to go to. Do you see that increasing? And secondly, and I'll just finish with this last question, do you see any realistic prospect of reunifying Ukraine?
Well, as to Crimea, yes, it was a popular place. I used to vacation in Crimea when I lived in Ukraine, and it was very, very popular. The numbers are down. The economy in Crimea is suffering. There's a lack of tourism, but there's another big issue, and this goes to connecting up with the Ukrainian people. The Zelensky government is trying to figure out now what to do about water. There's huge water shortages in Crimea. People do not have sufficient drinking water. What does the government do? As you know better than anybody, Mr. Fitzpatrick, 4 years ago, Ukraine shut off all the water supply. There's a vast series of canals that have been built connecting the Dnipro River and fed into Crimea and supported, basically supplied 90% of Crimea's water supply. The Ukrainian government has to decide whether or not to turn the tap back on to alleviate the suffering of the people, the Ukrainians still living in Crimea. But the question is, does that contribute to military and industrial enterprises that are propped up by Russia? Those are the types of tough decisions that Zelensky has to make, but my understanding, he's leaning towards turning on the water again because he wants to help improve the lives of daily Ukrainians. As far as your final question, is reunification possible? Yes, I believe it is. Again, the vast majority of Ukrainians want to see their country united again. I think President Zelensky is determined to do that, but it will be small steps like the prisoner exchanges and other exchanges. It's a very long-term prospect, and I truly believe, as I said in my opening statement, that sanctions will be the only thing that will ultimately bring Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table on Donbass and Crimea both.
Thank you, sir. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I appreciate, Ambassador Barry, your comments on open skies, on the Open Skies Treaty. I share the importance of continuing that. I was with General Walters just a few weeks ago. He echoed the same sentiment, so I hope that treaty that's on pause, can continue, because there are advantages, and you just brought forth a very important one in the Black Sea area in that naval incursion. One of Putin's greatest goals must be in the area that we're talking about is to seek division between the U.S. and our allies, our European allies. And I'd just like your opinions. How seamless is our approach right now? What are some concerns you might have in that regard? What can we do to make sure that the division does not extend to something that will hurt our ability in the area that we're discussing today? Ambassador Baer, do you?
Let me be quick at the outset and just say, I think you're quite right that it is an objective to divide the U.S. and Europe, and obviously to divide European countries within each other and against each other. That is an objective of Putin's government. And one of the things that I think is really important to highlight, especially in this context, is the importance of you all, because I think one of the challenges we have today, and I was in Munich a few weeks ago for the security conference, is that the Europeans aren't exactly sure where the United States stands. And so even those who are willing to still be good partners with us don't actually know exactly what we stand for right now. And we can go into the reasons for that, but I think one of the whatever one diagnoses the reasons being, one of the affirmative things that can happen is for members of the House and Senate to carry the flag and to drive home the importance of the transatlantic relationship, our commitment to it over the long term, and our commitment to the same principled kind of foreign policy that has been a hallmark of Republican and Democratic administrations since the end of World War II.
And that brought me to another point that I think is important too. What is the importance and why is it, other than deflecting the blame away from himself, why is Putin targeting, in your opinion, Ukraine for the fiction that they were involved in interference in the U.S. elections in 2016? Ambassador.
Because when somebody will buy a story, you sell it.
Yeah. Any other comments on that at all? Mr. Nix mentioned sanctions. What would you recommend for the type of sanctions? Is it against the oligarchs? Is it against, when you say sanctions, further sanctions, what did you have in mind?
I would advocate for a combination of both sectoral sanctions and individual sanctions. Again, we believe that they are having the desired effect. And to go back to your point, Mr. Chairman, about Russia dividing the allies, I think the sanctions issue is one where they've had success. We need to convince our European allies that they should not just merely extend European sanctions on the Russian Federation. They need to expand them as we have.
Okay. Any other comments on those points? Any other members seek to be recognized? Representative Wagner.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Nix, I understand that Georgia is interested in negotiating a free trade agreement with the United States. How would a U.S.-Georgian trade agreement impact the economic situation of average Georgians and internally displaced persons and those living in the occupied territories?
That is a trade agreement that the Georgian government would actively seek, covets, because it would drastically improve the economy. If you look at the polling data, the economy is the biggest issue among Georgian voters. I mean, we cite to the NATO and EU numbers, but when you ask what's the most important problem facing Georgian citizens, it's the economy and jobs. And certainly a trade agreement would help jumpstart the Georgian economy, which has been in free fall primarily because of Russian boycotts on Georgian goods.
I have one more question. Do you mind? In 2018, Georgia launched a peace initiative to improve the quality of life in the disputed regions. Ms. Vardanyan, how has the peace initiative furthered prospects for peace in Georgia, and how can the U.S. support these efforts?
Well, it's a great topic for me to discuss
Yes.
because we actually at Crisis Group we wrote a very comprehensive report on the situation with the development of trade prospects with the breakaway regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And during my travels to Abkhazia, for instance, I could see that actually many more people want to do trade, and this is mainly because of with problems with economy in Russia, and also the fact that they started receiving less funds after Crimea annexation, and also with problems with economy and sanctions-related issues. And this is the very moment actually to act, and that was a very positive step from the Georgian side that they started developing the plan, and I understand that this is still in making and some certain initial steps have been made. And if you allow me, you mentioned some free trade agreement, and I understand this is something that is still in the discussion, but the EU has already signed free trade agreement with Georgia, and we've already contributed heavily to the Georgian economy. And not only initiatives like these, they provide space and they give more ideas, to those who work on the conflicts. Because, for example, with EU trade agreement, it potentially can expand to the areas that are not under direct control of the Georgian government. And I understand that there are some European diplomats that are doing thinking on that. We wrote about this in the report. I will be happy to share more ideas. But I see that you have 2 more minutes. And would you allow me to jump on other questions that you mentioned, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty?
Yes.
In my past life, I used to be a journalist, and I spent 4 years working for the Radio Liberty. Georgia is a great country in terms of providing good lessons, including for Ukraine. In 2009, Radio Liberty, they opened a new program, a Russian language one, which is part of the Georgian service. It's called Echo Kavkaza, and I had an honor to work for it. This is the program that brings together journalists from the breakaway regions and from the rest of Georgia. It is 1-hour show, with news and stories from all these places. And I should say that in the beginning, when we were starting, it was extremely controversial thing because not everyone wants to hear the story from the other side. 10 years have passed. They actually celebrated an anniversary some weeks ago. And I can tell you that now with very service, with Echo Kavkaza, is the only one that in many cases provides the alternative to anything that is developing on the ground. And people turn to it, even the local ones, when they want to hear an alternative about the developments on the ground, because this is the only source of information made by the local journalists alternative to the Russian propaganda. So I would say that for me personally, this is a very good example how you start despite difficulties and problems, and you still reach out to the other side, you engage with them, and you actually, by giving them a chance to work with you, you are not fighting propaganda with propaganda, but you are working with them and you give them a chance to gather good source information.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the indulgence of the chair.
thank you.
And this peace agreement, the free trade agreement, Mr. Chairman, is something that we should probably
Yes.
talk about pursuing.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks, Representative. As a final invitation for a comment, when we organized this hearing, we didn't organize a hearing on Ukraine, individually on Moldova, individually on Georgia, individually. We put the 3 countries together for a reason. And I think if you wanted to have any final comments, if you could, just tell us, in your view, what's the importance of, for instance, what happens in Ukraine to Georgia, the importance of what happens in Ukraine to Moldova, the importance to the U.S., and the importance to our European allies. Mr. Nix.
Mr. Chairman, I think the common link, you mentioned the situation in the Black Sea. That is a common link between the 3 countries. And so you have the weaponization of the Crimean Peninsula by the Russian Federation. It is now bristling with airfields and surface-to-air missiles. It is used as a staging point to maneuver against both Ukraine and Georgia on the Black Sea. And then finally, the link to Moldova is that's exactly how the Russian 14th Army in Transnistria is supplied, through air transport from Russian bases in Crimea. So that's one of the common links that we face in these 3 conflict areas.
Great. Anyone else before we close? Ambassador Baer.
Yeah, I think, there are 2 recent events that connect to what we're talking about today in the last few weeks. The terrible humanitarian disaster in Idlib and the possibility of, the reality that close to 1 million people have been displaced and add to the humanitarian toll already of what has been an incredibly violent and devastating war in Syria. And the announcement, I think this morning or last night, that Putin has now successfully gotten the Duma to extend his potential rule until 2036. The first connects to why, Crimea matters to the broader picture, not only to us, but to our European allies, because the security of the Middle East is a crucial issue for them and one that their domestic publics are seized with. And the second, I think, connects to what we're talking about here today, because as much as we talk about Putin's desire to control Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia through these conflicts and to use them as tails that wag the dog, in my time in government, I came to believe that actually his bigger interest wasn't necessarily controlling them per se, but actually preventing their positive examples. The power of a democratic, prosperous Ukraine that has rule of law and that treats its citizens fairly no matter their background is one that would provide a powerful counterexample to the Putin who wants to rule until 2036 and who robs from his own citizens and doesn't run a system that actually delivers for them a promising future. And the same is true, obviously, of Georgia and Moldova. And so to me, it's even worse than it looks, because it's actually spite that causes him to try to tear these countries apart and prevent their progress, because he doesn't want to have to deal with the powerful example that they might set and show the Russian people what is possible in their country as well.
I couldn't agree more. I think that there's no coincidence that the active war started when they were unable to control the political side of things as Ukraine was moving towards EU membership. That is unquestionable, and that's what I think precipitated this as well. It's once more a reminder that in all these three countries, and we began with a film of a hot war that's going on right now in Ukraine, something for us to always keep in mind, that all of these countries are in the front line. They're in the front line in terms of the hybrid warfare that is occurring from Russia, and they're in the front line with an active military and hostile war that's occurring in Ukraine. Once again, we are honored to have veterans here this afternoon from Ukraine. Your presence is greatly appreciated here to remind us that you are indeed on the front line. With that, I'll adjourn and thank our witnesses for a very, I think, enlightening hearing. Thank you.